Karimi, welcome to Booktopia. It's great to have you here with your new book, Leila's Secret. How is being a doctor in Iran different from being a doctor in Australia?
There's a great difference between practicing medicine in Iran and in Australia. The science of medicine is more or less the same, and Iran is quite advanced in terms of theory and even equipment. But when it comes down to a deeper level of personal relationship between a therapist, a doctor, and a patient, there's a lot of differences, especially when it comes down to different gender, opposite sex, like as a male examining a female.
Well, I was wondering about that because your book is all about you telling these terrible stories of these illegal abortions that you've performed in Iran, and I was wondering about the embarrassment factor for veiled women to be examined by a man who is a stranger. Are there female doctors in Iran who would be able to make women feel more comfortable about that?
Yes, a majority of public a female patient will prefer to go to a female doctor. And after Islamic Revolution 1979, they changed rules for medical students. For example, men cannot become obstetricians, gynecologists anymore. Women cannot become a urologist and examine male genitals or things like that. And another law they passed a few years ago is a male doctor is not allowed to examine a female patient, regardless. This is about any kind of doctor, any specialist or GP, or in emergency situation or anything. A male doctor is not allowed to examine a female patient unless a close relative of that patient is present, right, as a chaperone. Like, it's ridiculous, and it's been very controversial, but they're still putting it into practice.
So I'm wondering, because you're kind of, you're part of two cultures. You're Iranian, but you're also Jewish. Now, in the Jewish culture, to be able to say as a woman, my son the doctor, this is a very prestigious profession. In Iranian life, is being a doctor something which is very prestigious and very highly respected?
Absolutely. My mom loved that. I've always felt uncomfortable, especially we lived in downtown, in slums of Iran, and then as soon as I was accepted in medical university, which was a great, massive challenge.
Huge achievement.
Yeah, they didn't allow me to go to university after I passed HSC, and because of the Jewish background, and finally I got accepted, and I was the first day I went to the medical university, my mom was telling all the neighbors, my son is a doctor, and I was getting, referrals from my mom, orthopedic patients, gynae patients, even kind of asking for medical advice. I had no idea. But I think I mentioned to you before, she always wanted me to become an astronaut because she was extremely ambitious woman. Yes. It's just the biggest question mark in my life, because she came from a humble family, and she had a very difficult life as a child, but she was extremely ambitious. And we were two brothers. She didn't put any of her aspirations to my brother. None of them. She chose me to make me suffer, and she was telling me, you have to become an astronaut. And my father wanted me to be a bus driver and drive his bus because he was getting quite old and frail. And my mom wanted me to. She was always saying, no, he has to study, he has to go to uni. And when we were talking about job, she would always say, astronaut. Now, I was telling her, Iran doesn't have any space programs, and you can't even manufacture a bicycle. And she was really serious. She was saying, by the time you grow up, you will have some. And thank God we never achieved that technology. Otherwise, I would be walking on the moon.
You would be out in space somewhere just to please your mother.
Yeah. So becoming a doctor was the
next best thing to being an astronaut. On a serious note, this is a very serious book about a very serious problem and a very serious issue for women in Iran. How many illegal abortions did you perform?
I did perform 250 or 300, something that range. You never count or keep records or anything. At close to 300 cases I did over the period of 5-6 years.
What happens to a woman, Kooshyar, who can't find a sympathetic doctor like you if she's pregnant and doesn't want the baby? What What's going to happen to her?
That's a very dark scenario, and that happens to a lot of women in Middle East and Africa, especially Northwest Africa. You know, there are, according to Amnesty International and UN statistics, they say at least 20,000 women every year are killed for honor killing in Middle East and Northwest.
20,000.
20,000 a year. That's very rough estimate, and we know that's the minimum, because there's no recourse. In a lot of countries, there's no persecution, there's no like a legal process to go after these people and arrest them. A lot of rural areas, women just disappear simply. A lot of women don't have a birth certificate. They're not recorded that they exist. And this is a very old, ancient tradition. It goes way before Islam, that women are a burden because they're a liability for family. Financially, they are a liability, and emotionally. What happens to those women? A lot of them commit suicide. A lot of them get killed for honor killing by their brothers or their fathers. Some of them survive and give birth to a child and leave the child somewhere. We have a lot of orphans in Iran. Yeah.
And you talk about orphans in your book.
Yeah, because we used to visit orphanage as a child with my mom. We went every few months. She took us there to see the kids. She liked, I don't know why. She had seen, because I think because she was an orphan. You know, her father was killed, and maybe that's why. And I remember it was a very sad thing for us to go. Every child we saw was heartbreaking, and many of these women can end up to some people who are not really health professionals. There could be anybody, and they use hysterometers, like a metal rod to stab into the uterus to cause abortion. A lot of them get peritonitis, perforation of uterus, and infections and bleedings, and lose their life or become infertile. So anything happens because it's not acceptable to have any form of sexual intimacy out of wedlock.
So the woman is at risk of being stoned to death, and the doctor performing the illegal abortion is also at risk of the death penalty. Is that right?
Over 16 weeks of pregnancies, and sometimes 14. It's a bit vague. Like, if you terminate the pregnancy above 14, let's say, you can get executed because it's considered as a murder. Because in Islam, when fetus is over 14 weeks, it's got a soul, it's a human being, and you're committing a murder by terminating that pregnancy. And the other part of it is repairing virginity. If you repair a girl's virginity, a woman's virginity, you'll be executed according to Islamic law in Iran.
And how many times did you do that?
Virginities, maybe 100 cases of virginity repairs.
And how?
And that's more serious than termination, you can imagine. Like if you terminate a 12 weeks pregnancy and they arrest you, you lose your house, you lose your medical license forever, and you go to jail for a few years. But if you repair a virginity, they execute you.
So, Kooshyar, when you were doing these operations and people came to you, how did you know who you could trust?
Yeah, that was a gamble. That was absolute. You never know. Yeah, you just judge based on. I had got a few patients that I couldn't trust, and I turned them back. And later on, when I was arrested, they told me everything. They knew patients from 4 or 5 years ago. They knew details of what happened to that patient. And it was amazing how much they knew about me.
So this is what you talk about in your first book, in I Confess,
Yeah.
so that basically the secret police had leverage with which to blackmail you into becoming a spy and giving away information about other Jews in Iran, because they did know some of what you were doing, but they didn't know the full extent, did they?
No, they didn't. But they knew a lot about my medical activities, which is illegal in Iran.
So given all of that and this incredibly harrowing story that you tell, I'm curious to know whether there's anything about life in Iran that you really miss. You're very settled here, you have your career as a doctor, you've got your family here, you've remarried, you've just had another child, as you said. But is there something about Iran that you still really pine for or feel homesick about?
I miss the red poppies that come out after the first rain in the spring. That's it.
That's it?
That's it. Unfortunately.
I thought you were going to say something about the food or the music or the culture or the architecture.
Yeah, now all of those you can get even in Australia, but you don't. I miss Iran's deserts and mountains and that mysterious historical silence that I experienced with my father with his bus when we were driving through the desert at night, and he told me stories of ancient Persian heroes, and that's how I got fascinated with literature.
Mm-hmm.
And I really studied Persian literature much more than medicine. I spent a lot of time, but when I was a medical student, I studied much more history, mythology, linguistics, etymology more than medicine really. Always, the people ask me how do you get time to write, because I work full-time GP. Today I'm at work, I start at 7 in the morning and I finish at 10 at night. I do 15-hour shift. And people say, how do you manage, like my wife asked me the first thing, she asked, how do you manage to write? I always tell them I practice medicine with my left hand and I'm right-handed. So I think if you have passion for something, you always find time to do it. Because you enjoy doing that, it's not the work, it's a hobby, like it's you.
No, well, you can really tell from reading this book, I have to say, that you are a great lover of literature, because you've done something quite remarkable in this book. You're telling your own story as the doctor, and then you, in a sense, inhabit or impersonate Leila, and you tell us her story by taking on her voice. So you split yourself in two. One half of you as a man, the other half as a woman, in a very empathetic way. Was that very difficult to do?
That was very difficult to start. I started this 6-7 years ago. It took me many drafts, and at the end, writing for my part of the story was more difficult than Leila, because I sympathize Leila so much, and I love writing her story because I owe her this. I owe all those women that came to me, and I managed to somehow help them, and sometimes I couldn't. So I really enjoyed writing her story, even if it was a big challenge. I like this challenge of talking on behalf of a woman. But when I was writing my story, I always had some kind of dislike autobiography, and my aim was not really writing my story, but I did it to disclose more about Iran, show more. It's not just Leila. There are so many women in similar situations.
Having read both of your books now, your first, I Confess, and Leila's Secret, I'm wondering, what are you going to confess or tell us next? Because these are two very strong stories, but I have a feeling that there's more to come.
Yeah, I have written a few, some novels, fiction and non-fiction, and I think a real writer always have a few. A publisher told me years ago in Iran, he asked me a similar question, and I said, I've got a couple of manuscripts, and he said, don't forget this, a good writer always have 2-3 more manuscripts in his drawer. And that's true. Like, if you really love writing, you always have some stories that never gets published, or you work on. Yeah, I've got a few more, and I'm working on them. And to confess more, I think there is a common core into all of those, is telling the story of ignoring human rights in the Middle East, in a big part of the world. 24 countries are in the Middle East, 205 million people, and more or less all of them suffer this similarity, of discrimination for women, for religious minorities, for even racism, and you see.
Kooshyar, it's a powerful story, and there must be so many women